Thus begins Rachmaninoff's second piano sonata. This has become one of the major sonatas of 20th century repertoire, as far as especially used in international piano competitions. But many great pianists have recorded this sonata. It certainly had a more checkered history during Rachmaninoff's own lifetime. So, what I want to do in this lecture demonstration, informal lecture demonstration to be sure, is to talk about the history of versions and performance versions of this sonata and how I came to form my own performance version of this sonata. So to start back at the beginning, 1913, Rachmaninoff composed this sonata. He quickly added it to his own repertoire as a performing pianist in Russia for the next 4 years. So he obviously enjoyed playing it enough to include it in his repertoire. In 1917, of course, you have the Russian Revolution. Rachmaninoff came from aristocracy, what you would call poor aristocracy, to be sure, but nonetheless not the kind of status you want to have in under the Bolsheviks in Russia at that time. So he left, took his family to Switzerland initially, eventually settled in California, Beverly Hills, along with many that had fled not only the Russian Revolution, but eventually Nazism in Europe. Thomas Mann lived close by, Arnold Schoenberg lived close by, many other European expats. But anyway, along about 1931, Rachmaninoff decided to revise his second sonata. And I've read assertions about why he did this. One record lining said that he wanted to make it representative of his current approach to pianistic style in 1931 compared to 1913. Another one went so far as to say that under the influence of a depression, which Rachmaninoff was prone to, that he emasculated the first version. So what was that comment getting at? The first version is longer. It tends to be more lush, more notes, more sonority, more drama than the second version. The second version trimmed about 5 minutes of music out of the original version. The original takes something like 25 to 26 minutes. The revised version could take 19 to 20 minutes. So he certainly trimmed it down. There was obviously some effort to tighten it up. I've even read that his model of the perfect sonata was Chopin's second sonata, which that was one of his most performed pieces in his own recitals. And that only takes 18, 19 minutes or something. And it was said that he was trying to tighten up his structure to match that with his own second sonata. Whatever the case, he tried performing his revised version from 1931 on, but he only performed it maybe half a dozen times, and he got the impression that it wasn't that well received. So he dropped his own revised version from his repertoire, which it's kind of sad to me that he was very sensitive to. He'd get these impressions in the Corelli variations, for example, when he would perform them, depending on what he was sensing from the audience, and who knows how much of that was projection, but whatever he was sensing, he might not perform 5 or 6 of the variations depending on how he thought it was going. He cut his own music in the process of performance. So he was not feeling that great about the second sonata, the revised version. And then his friend, the pianist, much younger pianist to him, Vladimir Horowitz, comes along and says, you know, Sergei, I would like to form my own performance version of this work. And what's reported is that Rachmaninoff agreed to that. So what Horowitz ended up doing was restoring parts of the original version, blended in with the revision, and made his own performance version. And it became one of the most spectacular pieces of Horowitz's repertoire. So we have, as pianists, we have Horowitz to thank, I guess, for opening the door to this third option. In other words, there's three options around performing this sonata. Just play the original version, the 1913 version, because you like it better. Just play the revised version, 1931, because you think that was Rachmaninoff's last word on the sonata. Or play some blend or hybrid compromise, however you want to describe it, between the two versions. And that's the door that Horowitz opened up. So you can find recordings of each of those three options. For example, Vladimir Ashkenazy chose to stick with the original 1913 version. Sergio Fiorentino chose the revised version from 1931. And there have been several pianists that have chosen the third option of that blending. My favorite of the blended version is the one recorded by Hélène Grimaud. Very judicious decisions, I think, around how to combine the two, plus a very powerful performance. So anyway, as I contemplated learning this sonata, I bought the Debussy Hawks version. They've done us the kindness of enclosing both the original and the revised version in one binding. So as I sat with both versions and go back and forth hundreds of times between the two, I finally decided I would like to make my own performance version of this sonata. So with that, let me start walking through it with you. I'm going to play the first 3 pages or so, and then come back and unpack what was the original, what was the revised in that particular section, the opening of the sonata. So that brings us to the second main theme of the first movement. Now, all the music up to that point, between the two versions, there is no substantial difference. By that I mean there's no difference in compositional form or architecture to the piece. Rather, you could describe the differences as cosmetic versions or cosmetic differences, meaning a few notes have changed, the texture has changed slightly, but the harmonies, the flow, nothing has really changed about that. So let me give you a few, probably just a couple examples of what I mean by cosmetic changes. So at the very beginning, this agitated notes, this chord, are from the original version. And they're difficult to perform. But thankfully, Rachmaninoff came up with a revised version of that note pattern there at the beginning. Much easier to perform. In the first version, you have the right hand, each of the da, 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 is a chord, and it's very difficult. It tends to tighten up the hand, the wrist. If not performed just right, you start locking up, and you're barely underway in the sonata. So the question is, do I really spend hours and hours trying to perfect the technique of doing that? Is it worth it? Is it worth the dramatic effect? Do I lose something by playing the revised version? It's easier, that pulls me toward using the revised version, but do I lose anything? In my judgment, you don't lose enough to make it worthwhile for the pain and the potential lockup of playing it in the original version. So I chose to go that way. One other quick example, and this really is a very minor change. Later in what I played, that part right there, that is from the original version. So I've been playing mostly second version, but I insert that because in the revised version, it's simply so you lose, for one thing, you lose. I've got three notes down there adding sonority to the chord in the original version compared to this in the revised version. Also, the continuation of the 16th notes in the left hand. In the revised version, I simply have whereas in the original version, which again is what I chose to keep, it comes out. What's different is that in the original, that G sharp is added compared to just playing it without. And that G sharp reflects the G sharps in the right hand, which create this dissonance. I'm exaggerating this, but it's in the chord. And then reflected in the accompaniment. So it keeps the tension of that dissonance, or heightens it, which which I like. So that's one example of a decision around a fairly cosmetic change, where I'm going along playing from the revised version, and then for actually 2 beats of one measure, I bring in the original version and then go right back into the revised version. So before going on to that second theme where I stopped, I want to point out some thematic relationships that enhance your understanding of the sonata, but also come to bear on decisions later in the piece around what to keep and what to blend and so on. So, at the very beginning, you have this plunge down to the abyss, right? And then this explosion, or this hammer blow of fate, or this exclamation, whatever you want to call it, this short note into a longer note, and it falls by that interval, which is 1, 2, 3, 4 half steps, a fall of 4 half steps. That 2-note motif, that's as brief a motif as you could possibly have, but it becomes important as it's developed later on. In the section I played so far, it comes up here. So he starts playing around with this falling motif. A fall of 3 half steps, 4 half steps, 3 half, and he reaches up, and it turns out to be the exact notes. So he's playing with that motif. He's shrinking and expanding the distance between those 2 notes as he plays around with it. Also, you get these wonderful harmonies underneath it that are much different from this. Here it's much more wistful, melancholy, whatever you might want to describe it. But let me accentuate now the harmonies underneath. So I'll just sort of do a stop motion version. Now I want to bring out the inner voice in this left hand. I'm going to exaggerate it so you can hear it, but it adds to this yearning quality. Then Rachmaninoff says, well, what if I flip this? What if I, instead of going down, leap up? Leap up by 3 half steps, 3 half steps, 4 half steps, 3 half steps, and so on. And then what if I keep expanding the distance in this leap? Okay, so now, the other important thematic material at the very beginning of the sonata, actually the most important thematic material because it's used in all 3 movements of the sonata, and it comes back in various forms and is developed a lot in this first movement, as we'll see. This, what you would call a motto theme. This is the motto. That comes up over and over again. And in this section I played through a while ago, it crops up already. In the left hand, so in all that running down, in the left hand you have the first three notes of that theme. In the right hand, you have a faster version of a modified version of that theme. It's not quite the same, but it's certainly recognizable as a variant of that main theme. So you get between the left hand and right hand. So on. And then leading to the second main theme, again you get that dropping short, long, short, long. Bringing us to the second theme. So I want to play a little bit more to continue this discussion. I'll just note right at the outset, though, that this it's the first three notes of the motto. It continues differently, but it's derived, at least the first three notes, from that motto. So I'm going to play up to a certain point. It's not very far, but what I am playing at this time, or in my performance version, is from the revised edition, the revised version of 1931. And there may be just a handful of notes that are even different between the two versions in this particular section. It's right there, that the two versions substantially diverge, and I'll show you how that is. By the way, I apologize for some of the roughness in performance as we go along. It's quite a trip to be talking and playing sections and going back and forth. But good enough, I hope, to give you an idea what's going on. So, as I said, that up to that point, not much difference. Frankly, I think the main differences in a couple measures occur in a couple measures, and it's just easier. So yeah, why not? It doesn't. I'm not sure most listeners would even hear a difference at that point. So anyway, we come to this juncture where in the revised version, the 1931 version, Rachmaninoff plays 5 measures. There are 5 measures that lead to the transitional material into the development. And I'll explain what I mean by the development a little later. Let me play from the revised version right now up to that point, up to the development, this shorter transition to the development, which is not what I use, but I want to give you some idea of the difference. And by the way, speaking of how well it's played, the parts that I didn't incorporate into my version they're not in my fingers nearly as well as the other ones, which this is a case in point. So here we go. Bringing us to this point, and these next, 4 measures lead directly to the development. Sound familiar? So that's the very beginning of the development section. Again, I'll talk about that more as we get to it. But I want to play for you what I'm including in my version from that point where I said it diverges. And that is 17 measures compared to 5 measures. So and Rachmaninoff introduces some new material. So here it is from that same juncture, the original version material. The start of the development section. So you see there's quite a bit left out and quite a build-up to those octaves that and then this is so Rachmaninoff, the continuation here, right? So you have a lot of drama that is excised out of the revised version. So the question to someone like myself coming up with a performance version between the two, I mean, what are the virtues of that shorter transition to the development compared to this longer version in the original, in the 1913 edition. And this is subjective, of course, but I just come up with that loss of the drama, the energy. I don't see that anything is gained structurally by cutting that stuff out. There's a lot, as I said, to be gained by the heightened drama. It really changes the character of the first movement to have that I just played taken out of it. Because in the recapitulation, the return section later in the first movement, you also have that same build-up, that same cascading of octaves down. So it's a big difference. So from here, as I said, we start the development section. I know a lot of you listening know what sonata form is, but some of you may not be as familiar. I'll be very brief with this. But if you asked an architect to build you a Cape Cod house, we have some notion of what a Cape Cod should be. We would recognize at the end of the day, no matter what's creative paths the architect took, or however he decided to make that particular Cape Cod, we would recognize it as a Cape Cod when the building is finished. Well, this is true of sonata form. When we say sonata form, it means certain expectations. Unfortunately, in piano literature, there are many so-called sonatas. And when we see that, we expect a large work that has 3 or 4 movements, and movements are their own compositions with beginning and end. Typically, you play one movement, come to an end, start the next movement, come to the end of that movement, go to the third movement or the fourth movement. So that's sonata in the big sense. But sonata form specifically, there's arisen an expectation around the first movement at least. There sometimes occurs in later movements, but in the first movement, that it will adhere to sonata form. Now I want to flip my analogy to that of literature. So the 3 parts of sonata form correspond to me by analogy into what happens in a good novel. So we have an exposition section or a play. The exposition, you get to know the characters, you get to know the circumstances, the conflicts and the challenges that are to be addressed in the exposition. The same is true in sonata form. We heard, so we get an impression of that character. We get an impression from all those long, short. We get the character of all in the exposition. As sonata form developed, and especially by the 19th century, and I must say that Rachmaninoff sonata is a outgrowth of 19th century, you could even say heroic sonata form. The development is expected to take the characters, if you will, the themes that we've been introduced to, and put them through different crucible, if you will, or put them through struggles, different keys, different rhythmic patterns, typically a little more turmoil than the outer sections. So those themes are developed, varied in different ways, put together, turned upside down, whatever it may be. And then you come to the recapitulation, in which you return to the very beginning of the movement, the same musical material. So for example, with this sonata, By the time you get to the recapitulation, you recognize essentially the same thing. There's some difference, but you will hear we have come back to the return of the sonata, and it's in the same key as it started. And so on. And then also with the recapitulation, the return to the beginning, it revisits material from the exposition. Oftentimes not as extensively, but it revisits the same territory, the same terrain, the same settings. And I like to think of this kind of like a Joseph Campbell's Hero of a Thousand Faces, especially this is a kind of a heroic, out of the heroic mold of sonata form. The hero, you get to know the hero's circumstances, his place of origin. Something thrusts him out into adventure, whether he's banished or he seeks adventure, whatever the story may be. The development section is all that turmoil and adventure and trials and ordeals. Once he's weathered all that and comes back, he comes back bearing bounty, bearing gifts, bearing a blessing of some nature. So the recapitulation comes back to the beginning, revisits the same territory, but seen through different eyes. So anyway, let's go back to the development of this particular sonata of Rachmaninoff. In the revised version, again, I want to show you the shorter version first, I think, which is the revised version, 1931. He starts with that familiar theme, right? Then he uses some of that transition material to the development we just heard. And then so up to that point we're getting versions of that main motto, the motto that we've talked about. And that brings us to a point where we recognize the second theme. Originally it was in this key, but here so he combines the second theme with this gorgeous you can kind of recognize the outline of the original theme in that, and continuing. Now, at that point, the two versions join again. Very, very similar. Again, merely cosmetic changes from that point to the end of the development and the recapitulation that I demonstrated a few minutes ago, the return of the beginning. So, you know, there's some things to be said for this version. It does develop the themes, but I want you to hear the original version up to that point, the development up to the point that I stopped, because to me, there's something, it feels more like a relentless, inexorable development of that main theme. And you remember the very start of the sonata, that plunge into the abyss. This development, I think that plunge is prefigures what we run into in the development of the first version. This motto theme keeps falling on top of itself over and over, cascading down, 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 down. And it builds and builds and builds, and it's to me it's just much more powerful than these few measures we heard as development in the revised version. So here is the development in the original version up to the point where I stopped before. Reminiscent of the second theme, but not an exact quote like it was in the other version. And that's where I stopped before. And while we're there, those last couple of bars, I really like the development of our short long drop, much more muted, and you can hear it here. In fact, let me play it so that you hear the notes of the drop. 4 half steps, 3 half steps. I'm sorry, 3 half steps. Here it is with the harmonization. I'm sorry. And then it continues. So, again, right up to that point, or at that point, the two versions converge again, substantively. But yes, I hope you could hear that continual layering of the motto theme going down, continually down and falling. And we're going to run into that in the development. I'm using development loosely in this sense, but in the development of the second movement as well. So structurally, you get that in both those places, whereas if you just go with the shorter development in the revised version, you don't get this. So I felt like, this is an important structural decision. This isn't playing just with a few notes. It's making the decision to say, Sergei, I think structurally it was better in the first version, and I'm going to play that. I'm going to stick with that. So there you have it. Let me play from the point where I left off up to the recapitulation, so you hear the continuation. I'll point out that in this section I'm going to play, you eventually get to more of the drop, ba-bum, ba-bum, short, long, short, long. But the intervals change. Again, he's already done that. He's expanded the interval a little bit, and he plays with that. And then it gets, even in this section, it's often referred to as bells coming in. Even there, these drops continue. I'm going to, again, slow motion a little bit. And so on. So let me play the point where the two versions join up until the beginning of the recapitulation. Okay, and like I said, these are substantially the same from that section I just played. There's one interesting difference in the revision. Rachmaninoff chose to cut out 2 bars at the very end of that development. So when this stuff is crashing down, right there, the original version continues, but Rachmaninoff skips that. To try to give you, I don't know, a clearer sense of the significance of that, I want to just strip it down a little bit and give you a sense of the chords. The crashing down part, if I reduce the chords to this, and then it's repeated, and then in the revised version, Rachmaninoff goes to the development. In the original version, the crashing down, again, crashing down, but then so with that additional chord, you get a heightened tension. You know, the difference between this chord so why did he cut that out? I have no idea. It doesn't last that long. I don't know what he thought he was gaining by getting rid of it, but I chose to retain it. Okay, so we come up to the point of the recapitulation. You heard the start of that. Let me play that again to a point where it diverges, and then I'll talk about the difference. Actually, there are cosmetic differences between the two versions. And in this instance, I chose to stick with the revised version. I think it has some, in some cases, less notes, but more drama. There's some syncopation, for example, in what I'm about to play that doesn't come through in the original version. So again, but nothing structurally different between the two versions in what I'm going to play next here. So just like in the exposition, here in the recapitulation, we come to that second theme. But the way in which Rachmaninoff gets there is different in the immediately preceding measures. So in the original version, you have material that's like the he retains material from the exposition of the first version. If you remember that, at least this time, this time, in recapitulation sections, the composers need to end up in a key that facilitates them ending up in the home key. So, since Rachmaninoff is keeping this stuff, he has to work his way to a different place harmonically. Up there. And again, I'm sorry for butchering that figuration, but primarily I want you to get the idea harmonically he's shifting toward that. And again, this is subjective. I don't like prolonging all of that before we get there. I think it's actually a more elegant way to end up there in the revised version. So that's why I kept this. So there you have it. Again, there is some material that is substantially the same. I'll play up to the point again where it diverges. there is where it diverges again. So what happens here is like what happened in the exposition earlier. You remember I was talking about 5 measures at the end of the exposition in the revised version compared to 17 measures in the original version, and that those 17 measures contain some very dramatic material. Well, the same is true here. By foregoing the original version, those 17 measures, we don't have a comparable section leading to the end of the sonata in the revised version. So in the revised version, here's how Rachmaninoff sets up the ending. Shorter and again less dramatic. So at the point I stopped, then the run up to the ending itself. That was so badly played. Let me try it again to give you a little better idea how that goes. A little better. But the thing I want to point out there is that it's this sort of language. There's no drama. I mean, it's characteristic of lots of the movement. But now listen to from that same point in the original version, which I'm including in my performance version. I'm sorry, I lost memory of that, but that's okay. That gives you an idea. Much more dramatic material included in that section, and again, I chose to keep it primarily for that reason. I don't know why it was cut out, and I think it works great leading up to the conclusion of the of the first movement. And here again, from there to that point, the differences are primarily cosmetic. I mean, he does write different notes and so on, but we use the motto theme at the very end. So here's the version I use, which is from the original. Now, those last two chords, I have to confess, I pick up one chord from the revised version. And I must say, this is usually used even by those who perform the original version. They'll pick up this last chord because it's such a nice stroke. In the original version, it ends this way. So in other words, this B flat minor chord is all that you hear harmonically as the motto is stated for the last time. In the revised version, the D flat major chord shifting down, much more satisfying. By the way, D flat to B flat. Well, we've got 2 movements to go, and that will require another YouTube recording. You can see in the information for this one a link to my full performance of the Rachmaninoff Piano Sonata No. 2 in the version that I have put together that I'm talking about. Thank you.